strap yourselves in, hold on tight, because we're about to set foot in the most haunted house in England. But before we get started, a big thanks to everyone who supports this podcast by signing up to my patreon.com site. It'll cost you about the price of a cup of coffee if you want to become part of the family here. You get early access to everything, you get exclusive access to a weekly question and answer session, but you can ask me anything. I really don't mind, and nothing's off the table. You ask the questions and I do my best to answer them, and the details for joining are down there somewhere. Okay, now it's time to consider the places and the houses we stay in or visit that can leave a lasting impression. It's unavoidable if you stray into ghost story territory that some of it you run into ghost stories that are so traditional, they've been so told and retold, debunked, scoffed at, had chat rooms dedicated entirely to them, that you get into almost the realm of cliche. And I'll be upfront and say that today's episode is about one of those haunted houses that sort of ticks all of those boxes. It's about Borley Rectory. But before we get to Borley, that most venerable of haunted houses, depending on your point of view, I'd like to tee this up by talking about something that happened to me. People have, I suppose, have been in expectation of hearing about my own paranormal encounters in this context, but the truth is they've been few and far between. I've met a lot of people who've told me their own stories, but myself, I've experienced very little. However, something did happen to me some years ago now when I was filming a television documentary series. About 1,000 years ago, in a lifetime and a career that I can barely remember, I used to make soft television documentary series, and one of them was Coast Australia, which grew organically out of Coast, which I made for the BBC in the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And then between about 2013 and 2018, I made offshoots called Coast Australia and Coast New Zealand, which involved or gave my family and I the stupendous opportunity to go out to those countries and spend a lot of time there. Between 2013 and 2018, I visited Australia, and New Zealand, but I visited Australia more times than I can count. I really don't know if I could piece together how many times I was out there. 20, 30 times. I was part of a team. We made Coast Australia for Rupert Murdoch's channel. I mean, as you can imagine, especially when it came to, New Zealand's big enough, in as much as it's kind of UK-sized, but Australia is enormous. It's a continent and an island and a country. And circumnavigating it for the purposes of something like Coast took a lot of effort. There's no way to do it in one trip. So I was back and forth, and we made multiple seasons of the series anyway. And actually, for a while, I had a platinum loyalty card from Emirates Airlines. That's how often I was out there. So as part of filming the fourth and the final series of Coast Australia, we went to the Cocos Islands. Now, the Cocos Islands are a speck on the map, a few dots of Australian territory, sort of cut adrift and off in the Indian Ocean, halfway to Sri Lanka, but stunningly beautiful. And, they had their own interesting story to tell. We went out specifically to tell the story of a Scots family called the Clooney Ross family. And they were de facto kings and queens of the Cocos Islands from 1827 until 1978. And we stayed on the Cocos for a while, but we spent a single night in the house, the grand pile that had been the centre, the HQ of the Clooney Ross domain. It was actually quite an underwhelming place architecturally. It wasn't really much to write home about. It was called Oceania House. But what made it of interest, in many ways actually, was that according to the locals, Oceania House is and always was haunted. So it's the only publicly declared haunted house I've ever spent the night in, which would have been enough to make it stand out in my memory anyway. The story of Kokos and the Clooney Ross family is worth recounting in brief. The little archipelago, for it's like 20 odd little coral atolls that make up the Cocos. They were originally discovered by the European end of the world, let's say, in 1609 by a ship's captain called William Keeling. Basically, all Keeling did was make a note, jot down the coordinates of his discovery, and then, he sailed on. And then the islands remained untouched and uninhabited until the arrival of a Scottish merchant in another ship. He was John Clooney Ross. And he came originally from Weesdale in Shetland, north of Scotland. So, in terms of antipodes, he was about as far from home as it was possible for a Shetlander to get when he came across the Cocos Islands. He was skippering a brig called the Olivia, and he was exploring and really checking out the economic potential of whatever he could find in the Indian Ocean. This is 1825, right? So that earliest encounter was 1609 by William Keeling. So it wasn't until 1825 that as far as anyone can tell, anyone else found it. Still completely uninhabited, but stunningly beautiful. 27 coral islands. And Clooney Ross he fell in love. He was instantly amazed by this heaven on earth. And also, significantly, decided that a fortune was to be made by growing and selling coconuts. Presumably, some coconut trees were already growing there, and he presumably could see that they were thriving, that the ecosystem was in their favour, and he thought, I could sort of do this on an industrial scale. So, and within 2 years, he had moved his family. He had relocated his wife and kids from Shetland to the Cocos. He then, controversially but significantly in the scheme of things, he imported a bunch of Malaysian people as workers. He brought them over. Not exactly, force anybody, but leave it to your imagination to contemplate the circumstances in which these people, these Malays, found themselves in. Nonetheless, they are those people that Clooney Ross the first brought in as workers to plant his coconuts and harvest them, are the ancestors of this. There's now a population of about 600 or so Sunni Muslim Malays there, and they are the bulk of the indigenous population. And after that first John, he was followed by 4 generations of his descendants, of his sons. And they maintained a kind of an autocracy out there. There was no one to see what they were up to. They were literally in the middle of nowhere, and they could and did do largely whatever they wanted. And that also meant that they were in control of the people. The first John's grandson was George Clooney Ross, and he was on the throne, if you like. I'm being hyperbolic. He wasn't actually the king of the Cocos Islands, but that's pretty much how that family carried themselves. But he had stewardship of the place, ownership of the place, when Queen Victoria herself decided to grant the Clooney Ross family ownership of the Cocos in perpetuity. That's to you and yours forever. And so it was, and so it went on. And that situation prevailed until 1979, when, under pressure, the then Clooney Ross, John Cecil Clooney Ross, found himself really having no option but to sell the archipelago to the Commonwealth of Australia. Australia made it plain that they weren't going to tolerate this private family holding the territory. So, under threat really of expropriation, the paperwork was filled out and they handed the place off. So that ended the reign. So then cue us, 2018, I think, turned up at Oceania House, and it is the epitome of a place apart. My reaction, judge me if you will, but I found it a completely incongruous edifice. To me, it just didn't fit It was a kind of a literal transplanting. It was a cuckoo in the nest, something that belonged in the north, really transplanted to the south. It's had a checkered past, but by the time we were there, it was being run as a guest house. But it's still, even then, it had the feel of times past. There was a lot of the 19th century still there. From the outside, it was quite striking in as much as it was white brick. I seem to remember the white brick of the exterior being glazed, so that in the heat of in the light of the sun, it was quite dazzling. And then inside, it was full of very dark wood, aged pine. Oceania House sits on what they call Home Island, which is the main one of only 2 of the 27 islands or islets that are actually permanently inhabited. 25 of them are just, there's no one there. Home Island is the main one. And when we rocked up, and before we got to the house, we spoke to locals. We encountered people. And when we said where we were going and that we were going to stay the night, they said, and some of them weren't joking. Some of them were kind of pulling our legs a bit, but some of them made it pretty plain that they believed the place was the home of spirits, about which we had been unaware. And when we said who is it, who haunts the place, they weren't really. It wasn't clear. There was just this overweening sense shared by the Malay population that you didn't want to go there. They didn't want anything to do with the place. They did not make any kind of habit of going there. And when you try to unpick what might have been the cause of the atmosphere, it's pretty apparent that from the available records that the Malay workers had hard lives inflicted upon them. HMS Beagle, no less, found its way to the Kokos for 7 weeks in 1836. Charles Darwin aboard, of course, and he, amongst other things, recorded the plight of the human inhabitants of the islands. He said that they seemed discontented, and when he described their settlements, he said that they had a desolate air. They appeared poor, and their houses were destitute of furniture. So it's hard. It's there's always trouble in paradise. So for all it's a beautiful place with this astonishing climate, and it looks like your kind of picture postcard perfect desert island, tough lives were being lived there. Darwin said in 1836 when he visited that the people appeared, quote, nominally in a state of freedom as respects their personal treatment, but in most other points they are considered as slaves. So that says a lot. From a trained observer like Darwin, that was his assumption. So if you then read between the lines, it would appear credible that Oceania House was seen by the present day inhabitants, the people there when I was there, to have been a place of some suffering, associated with suffering. And the feeling was that it held something of that. It held something of the spirit, or the spirits of those that went before, as though their unhappiness, that tough life, had lingered somehow, and maybe found a focal point at Oceania House, which was the kind of the point around which life on the islands had to orbit. And as I say, the locals just gave it a wide berth, didn't want anything to do with it. So we turned up, and our hosts, the people owning it, who were I think, if memory serves, they were just sort of Australians of European descent. And they were very friendly, and they kind of let us in, and then we went off to do filming. And we did a little bit of filming inside the house as well. And around the walls of the hallway, the main sort of entrance hallway, mounted like hunting trophies, were all these bronzes of the heads of the various Clooney Ross patriarchs. And they had all turned quite a bright, almost luminous green, with the verdigris of ages. And they were quite a collection. That first John had, to me, he had sort of a like the way you'd imagine somebody like a Mr. Rochester being portrayed in a black and white movie. And then his son, John George, had this fantastic ZZ Top beard. Then his son George had like a Viva Zapata moustache, the big sort of droopy moustache. And then there was John Sidney. He had a much more restrained moustache. And I remember it seemed like the appetite for luxurious facial topiary had diminished with the passing of the years. And to walk past them in chronological order, you couldn't help but noticing a kind of a physical decline in a way. And there was a sense in which each son of the family had understood, consciously or subconsciously, that his power was waning. There was a clock ticking somewhere, and their hold on the place was always slipping through their fingers a bit like sand. That what they had could not last. Anyway, it was, apart from anything else, it's the oddest guest house I've ever been in. It's one of the strangest places I've ever stayed. The people were very welcoming, absolutely, but in terms of a guest house, it didn't really feel as if they were ready for us to turn up. It was like rocking up at Miss Havisham's house from Dickens, as though her house had been transported to the tropics. There was dust everywhere, on every surface, and there were all these dried out beetles and cockroaches and things on the floor up against the skirting boards and stuff. I had this kind of air of decline. I was showing up to my room, after we had done a bit of the filming and we took a bit of a break, and I was showing up to my room, and it was very dark, all this dark wood, panelled from floor to ceiling, minimal furnishings really. It was unbelievably hot, but then again, it was the middle of the Indian Ocean in summertime. It came to night time, all right? The rest of the day unfolded. We had dinner elsewhere, came back to the house, and we all all of us, so that would be me, the director, cameraman, a sound recordist, and a researcher, we all, said our goodnights and went off to our various bedrooms. And it was at that point that I noticed, for one thing, that there were no mosquito nets, not over the windows and not around the bed or anything. And so at first when I lay down, slick with sweat, all I could hear was, that whine of mosquitoes making their way towards your ears. And that was my first tribulation. But I'll be quite honest, I'd had a bit of wine with dinner, and I actually got to sleep quite quickly, despite the heat and despite the bugs. But then, after I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up, and it wasn't that kind of wakening into a soft doze that suggested I would quickly fall asleep again. When I say I woke up, I was wide awake, like I'd been sort of thrust on stage somewhere. But in the same instant I was awake, I knew I wasn't alone in the room. It was pitch black. But also, as well as knowing I wasn't alone, I had this, I couldn't move. I was paralysed. I could not move. And I wanted to reach for my phone because it's got a light on it. More than anything else, I wanted to be able to switch on a light. But I couldn't move. And I don't know how long it lasted, but I lay there for a while. And you'd imagine that the next thing I'm going to say is that I was transfixed with terror, but I wasn't. What I really remember feeling was disbelief. Also, it was a bit like an out-of-body experience. It felt as though I was watching it all happen to someone else. We'd been told the place was haunted. It was too cliched for words, and we'd been joking all day out doing the filming. We'd been having a laugh all day about what was going to happen at night, and I knew sort of dimly, I suppose, I was aware of the fact that they were all the rest of my team were everywhere around me. I knew as well, before anyone mentions, there's a phenomenon of sleep paralysis. Right, it's widely reported. People waking up, sometimes terrified, unable to move, sometimes with a crushing weight on them as though something's sitting on them, and all of the rest of it. Sometimes, in a kind of a dream state. I knew all about that. Even as it was happening to me, I was aware of the cliche of it. But nonetheless, there I was, paralysed in my bed in a pitch black room in a haunted house, in which I could absolutely detect someone standing close by. Absolutely. And I actually said out loud, hello. And it was ridiculous to me even as I was doing it. And I also thought, or I think I did, maybe I thought this later, I thought I was maybe being pranked. I thought maybe the team, the director and the cameraman and the rest, had got together and decided to come in and give me a fright. But I looked at I could see the bedroom door because it was outlined in light, because a light was obviously on in the hallway outside. So I could see the line of, so I could see that the door was closed. And I thought, well, it seemed unlikely that someone could have got in and shut the door behind them without me being aware of it. Anyway. So nobody offered any kind of reply to my hello. And then all of the feelings just passed away. I was able to move. I rolled over. I got my phone off the floor. I switched it on. I found the light switch. I put on the overhead lamp, and there was nothing. There was no one. And I just sat down on the bed, sort of, kind of overwhelmed, I suppose, by what had just happened. And I just lay down. But I don't remember sleeping anymore that night. So, as far as it goes, that's my experience of something unexplained, where I sensed the presence of an invisible other. And that's what, so I put that in the context of the story about Borley Rectory, because it's the only thing I can offer in terms of an almost cliched experience of the paranormal in a reputedly haunted house. And I mention it also because really in previous episodes, I've talked about places like Windsor Castle and other Edinburgh Castle and the Palace of Holyrood House, the sort of grand places that perhaps traditionally we associate with haunting. But as it turns out, I would say strangeness, the sense of something strange can accrete also around and within unprepossessing places that don't seem to be the right sort of stages set for that kind of drama. So when I first saw photographs, because for photographs is all there is of Borley Rectory, it's in Essex. I haven't mentioned that yet, have I? It's in Essex. It was its essential drabness when I saw the photographs that reminded me of Oceania House. Neither of the buildings looked right as the settings for the paranormal. It was a bit like, it was like finding out like a maiden aunt's got a taste for rap music or something, or some, quiet living relative takes part in satanic rituals. There was a disconnect, there was a discordance. But Borley Rectory was a big house, 30 rooms. It sat up on what was effectively a low hill, just higher ground, I suppose, relative to the surrounding village of Long Melford and the market town of Sudbury nearby. You'd call it a mansion. It was built of red brick. It had stables attached. There was a farm close by that wasn't anything to do with the rectory, but was the sort of nearest neighbour. It faced the rectory as you'd expect. The manse, the home of the local churchman. It faced the village church, and it was surrounded by the village. Your typical English village. It sits either side of the Essex-Suffolk border. What happened to Borley Rectory? Well, a fire. That's why it's not there anymore. And the insurers that came in and looked at it said the fire had been started deliberately, razed it to the ground in 1939. And anything that was left was flattened within a few years. It was just, there was no point in rebuilding it. And if you go there now, it's a modern housing development. Well, I say modern, probably built in the last half century or so. And it almost goes without saying that amongst the residents of the modern houses are those who say that they've seen things, heard things, felt things. Electrical items switching off and on by themselves. Lights switching on and off by themselves. Inanimate objects moving of their own accord without anyone touching them. So it begins, like so many of these places, stuff starts to gather around it, like sheep's fleece on a rusty nail on a gate. Stuff gets caught in the vicinity of what was Borley Rectory. The first reverend, for whom the place was built, was Henry Bull. The house was built in the 1860s, and it in itself replaced an earlier rectory that also burned to the ground. Now, you'd say to lose one rectory to a fire on a site would be bad luck, but two, one after the other, in the same place, you might merit some investigation. Nonetheless, the new rectory, the 1860s rectory, was built, and it was immediately haunted. Apparently, the Bull family, saw a ghostly nun, or reported a nun, roaming about the place. And there is a backstory that you hear in relation to Borley Rectory, that it was built on the ruins of a 13th century monastery. Now, that's never really been verified. And in fact, even the existence of the monastery might only have been a product of the imagination of the girls of the family, because the girls, the daughters of the Bull family, told each other and anyone who would listen ghost stories. They were in the habit of it. But in any event, legend had it that once upon a time there had been a population of monks, and also nearby a population of a convent, nuns, and that in some sort of Romeo and Juliet scenario, a monk from the one had met and fallen in love with a nun from the other, and they had planned to run away together, but they were caught and they were killed, according to the story. And she was killed by being bricked up inside a cavity in the wall of the convent, hence the ghostly nun. So I'd be the first to admit, you could scoff at the stories and say it was all just the fancies and fantasies of teenage youngsters entertaining themselves in the midst of a landscape that was otherwise a bit boring. But in any event, when the elder Bull, Henry, died, he was succeeded in the role by his eldest son, Harry. He was the next reverend. And he had grown up as the youngest child, and he loved his sister's stories. Okay, so he was affected by what he was told as a kid. He was what they used to call a confirmed bachelor for most of his life. He liked a bit of hunting, a bit of shooting, a bit of fishing, and he was well liked by his parishioners, to whom he dedicated most of his time. His sisters as well, who were very much involved in the life of the parish. And everything was, apart from the ghost stories and the vague reports of hauntings and the ghostly nun, it was all peaceable and good spirited, if you like, pardon the pun, until later in life. Later in life, he married a younger woman. Okay, Harry marries someone half his age who is a Catholic. He's Protestant. He's of the Protestant faith, and he marries a Catholic who has a daughter from a previous marriage. And they live nearby, they live close by the rectory, until the day comes when his sisters, who have been left living in the rectory after their parents, they all abandon the place, for easier circumstances. And at that point, Harry and his little family moved into the rectory and lived there for some years, untroubled, it has to be said, by ghosts of any sort. They had no experience of anything. After their time, after the Bulls were finally gone, the rectory was taken on by the Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife, who was a frail individual, frail physically, let's say, called Mabel. And maybe she was a little bit frail of emotional strength and whatever. In any event, her mood appears to have been affected by frequent visits during her tenure by Edith Bull, one of the sisters, now an elderly lady, but still in the habit of coming back and forth. And she told Mabel all about the hauntings. Right? She told her all the stories. And Mabel was affected by this and started having her own experiences. Take from that what you will. And the Reverend Smith, her husband, contacted the Daily Mirror newspaper to report it all. And what he reported, what he was able to tell the journalist at the paper, was pretty standard stuff. The ghostly nun was back. He was able to embellish that by reports that the elder Bull, Henry Bull, had actually had a window bricked up in the house during his time there to stop the ghostly nun looking in at them while they were eating their dinners. There was talk of, heavy footsteps from rooms known to be empty, lights going on in rooms locked from the outside, the ringing of the servants' bells. That's a recurrent one. It's one of these old piles where there were wires, cables, and the family could ring bells in the sitting room, in the drawing room, or whatever, and a bell would ring on a board in the servants' quarters, and a servant would come running. But these things would go off when no one had touched them, apparently. There was even talk of a horse-drawn carriage that would be seen on the grounds, unexplained. Now, the story, the official version of events goes that the Reverend Smith had only contacted the paper because he thought they could put him in touch with an entity called the Society for Psychical Research, an entity established at, previous to any of this, and with people, in the habit of investigating such reports. But the people at the Mirror didn't do that. They went another way with the story. And what they did infamously, and this is where a name comes up that everyone will know in relation to Borley Rectory that's read anything about it, they contacted a guy called Harry Price. Harry Price was a self-styled ghost hunter. He was a man of many parts. He had certainly claimed that he was originally an archaeologist. He sold greaseproof paper to butchers. He wrote copy for assorted newspapers. At some point, surprise, surprise, he developed an interest in magic, like conjuring, stage magic, illusions. But by the late 1920s, his passion was the paranormal. Harry Price is notorious. He was dismissed as a fraud, a charlatan, in life and after his death in 1948. But in any event, he was associated with all kinds of paranormal activity. He made his name with it. Borley Rectory was his magnum opus. It was his pièce de résistance. And in 1940, he published his most famous or infamous book, which was called The Most Haunted House in England, 10 Years of Borley Rectory. And it made him some money, and it made him a reputation. That Reverend Smith and his wife, they left soon after. Soon after they made contact with the Mirror, soon after they had encountered Harry Price, they left. But because of Harry Price, interest in Borley Rectory persisted. The next tenants, you don't need to remember all these names. It's a succession of men of the church who take on the place. And the next one was the Reverend Lionel Algernon Foister. Here's a good name. He was a cousin of Harry, the younger Bull. And the Reverend Lionel Foister and his much younger wife Marianne and their daughter Adelaide were the next incumbents of Borley Rectory. And it was during their time, this is the family to really remember, it was during their time that the paranormal, peaked in Borley Rectory. And Harry Price, God love him, came back to the house to pick up the story that he'd been, covering previously. And he recorded more than 2,000 incidents, right? 2,000 separate events in Borley Rectory. Hence the name of, Most Haunted House. It's everything. Doors would lock and unlock without anyone being involved. Inanimate objects moving around, appearing, disappearing, disembodied voices. There was the sound of a piano. There was a piano that played by itself. Footsteps up and down stairs, walking across the floorboards of rooms thought to be empty. Glimpsed figures, shadows, apparitions, lights. The servants' bells ringing, when no one's in the room involved. Objects thrown about in that kind of, poltergeist phenomenon. Furniture thrown around, people coming back into rooms and the tables upside down, chairs piled on top of it, the whole poltergeist effect. And there were any number of witnesses. It wasn't just, people would walk in on the aftermath. People would be in the house. There'd be a clatter, a flash of light, a noise, a scream. People would gather in a room and there'd be evidence. There'd be some sort of chaos. Or something had moved or was broken on the floor. And as I have freely admitted, Borley Rectory is roundly dismissed as a lot of nonsense. Famous, infamous nonsense, but nonsense nonetheless. And when people have looked back on Borley Rectory at that time, they've drawn the conclusion that it was Marianne, Marianne Foister was behind it all. Now, the reasonable question would be, was she the focus of paranormal, supernatural activity? Was she consciously, unconsciously manifesting something that was real in that sense? Or was she just, playing tricks on everyone around her? No one seems to be in any doubt that she was an unhappy person, broadly speaking. She had a much older husband. Life in the house was hard. It was a big house, but it was cold and it was drafty. There was no money for the requisite number of servants. It had no electricity or gas or piped water even. So, it'd be a tough furrow to plough living in the place. And she's associated with everything else that happened. And definitely the most notorious phenomena was the appearance and the disappearance of messages that were written on the walls or on scraps of paper. The walls were damp because seemingly the thing had been constructed using sand from a nearby beach, rather than inland sand, and the salt content in that sand made the walls damp, and so some of the messages were sort of written in the condensation, just on the wetness, and almost all of it was addressed to Marianne, asking Marianne for help, offering prayers for Marianne. Lionel Foister, her husband, he wrote 3 separate accounts of everything that was happening to him and around Marianne. And it may well have been the case that, like Harry Price, he just wanted to make some money, but by selling some salacious or sensational stuff. The income of a parish priest in the Essex countryside in the 1940s. It's not a lot of money, so he may well have been just doing something to boost his income. Factor in again, his wife, younger woman, unfulfilled, let's say, in all manner of ways by her marriage, by their surroundings. Is she just keeping herself amused? There was a lodger, a guy called Frank Peerless, and later Marianne would confess or admit or maybe make up that the pair of them had been lovers while he stayed at Borley Rectory, and for a period of time after he had moved elsewhere, they stayed in touch. So perhaps, there were bumps in the night right enough, and on the point of being discovered, Marianne had to concoct supernatural stories to cover up something, altogether more earthly that was going on behind the scenes. The Foisters left the rectory in 1935. And after that, after 1935, all the activity ceased. So it's all a bit conspicuous. She's no longer in the house, and neither is the paranormal activity. But either because he was a committed ghost hunter or because he knew a good thing when he saw it, Harry Price, the ghost hunter, continued his investigation of Borley Rectory. And he started employing people to stay in the house, always in pairs, to record and write down and make a note of anything that happened. There were events, but nothing on anything like the frequency or the scale of what Marianne Foister had reported for years. But undeterred by that, by the relative inactivity, and somehow or other, Harry Price had got hold of Lionel Foister's scribblings about it all. So he had a dossier compiled by the incumbent resident of the place. With all of that, it was then, and with that background, that Harry Price produced his bestseller that made Borley Rectory the national obsession that it was. And it became a cause célèbre. People were coming from all over the country to see it, to visit it, in hopes of having encounters of their own. And apparently so many people were prowling around that the villagers started taking down the road signs nearby so that people couldn't find the village. They were so sick of people turning up. So they redirected all the traffic to keep people away. And Borley attracts visitors to this day, fans of the paranormal. Countless books have been written about the place. I mentioned there's chat rooms. You can find stuff online where people gather remotely to talk about things that they claim to have experienced there. In the year 2000, there was a really comprehensive attempt to debunk Borley Rectory. It was called We Faked the Ghosts of Borley Rectory, and it was written by a fascinating character called Louis Marling. The place is definitely associated with interesting characters. Make of that what you will, and Louis Marling was another one. He wrote the book, and he claimed that he had been connected to the house one way or another, almost from childhood, in ways that he doesn't really make clear. But he says that he was a guest and a visitor. He was a friend of more than one of the families, that he got to know and was familiar with more than one of the reverend families that were there. Some of his critics, because Louis Marling has his critics along with everybody else connected to Borley Rectory, some said he was never there at all, and that he just made the whole thing up as a shameless self-promotion because he wanted attention. But anyway, his account of how it was all a fake and that he was a part of it is quite compelling. He talks about how they faked the ringing of the servants' bells, that there were hidden passageways within the building. Remember, by this time the building's long gone, so none of this could be checked or verified in any way. Secret doors. He talks about seances, and there undoubtedly were seances held over the decades in Borley Rectory by more than one group. Marling says that he was part of seances involving folk like George Bernard Shaw and T.E. Lawrence, that's Lawrence of Arabia. Marling says that he would dress up and play the part of a headless man who was amongst the apparitions that people said they saw in the garden or in the vicinity of Borley Rectory. Borley Rectory's gone. England's most haunted house is no more. But, I would say, because it involves multiple families and multiple witnesses, as I say over and over again, it seems improbable to me that everyone was lying all the time. It's possible, but I would contend that in amongst all of it, there must be some of it that somebody wholeheartedly experienced. Like the thing I experienced in Oceania House. Now, you can say to yourselves, oh, he's just making that up because he's doing a podcast about ghost stories. But I tell you, that's what happened to me in that house in the Cocos Islands, of all places. And I'm persuaded that at least some of the people talking about Borley Rectory must have experienced something that was to them inexplicable. And then there's a theme that I keep coming back to about the wider emotional context of places. The experience of the Bull children, the children of the first family, the experience of the Smiths, poor Mabel, the experience of the Foysters, Marianne, they were happening in the years between World War I and World War II, broadly speaking, and those were hard years for everyone. A population in large part shell-shocked by the horror of World War I, the loss, the carnage. Added to which you've got the great and the good laid low, the great estates, winnowed, harrowed, the lost generation, these big houses, the landholders, they were hit and could no longer maintain the lifestyles that had gone before. There was economic hardship. Then there was, the financial collapse of the latter part of the 1930s. It also coincides with that resurgence of interest in spiritualism, which we mentioned before, which was a faith that kicked off in the United States of America, but then spread around the world, when uncounted numbers of people sort of opened up to the idea that, or to the hope that it might be possible to contact the dead, because so many people were alive at the one time who had lost relatives, they'd lost sons, they'd lost fathers, they'd lost husbands. So there was an upswelling of an appetite to reach out into the unknown. What's reported at Borley Rectory was happening against that wider context. And one family after another in Borley Rectory found it hard to live in the place. It was dilapidated. It was, it lacked all but the most basic amenities. In earlier times, when servants were cheaper and affordable, and gardeners and all the rest of it, the life there might have been pleasant. It might even have been idyllic. But in the straitened circumstances of the diminished years between the war, it was a hard place to be. And hard lives lived in the shadow of loss and grief might give rise to anxieties and doubts and emotions that manifest, that make other things happen. I had my own thing in the Cocos Islands, which, hand on heart, that's what I experienced. I don't know what happened, except that it happened. But when it comes to Borley Rectory, I've only, like all of us, I've only got the words of others. I've only got other accounts. But to conclude, to come back to Louis Marling, who was an eccentric character of uncertain motive, but he did, in amongst it all, in his debunking, now remember, he debunked Borley Rectory. In amongst that, he said that he had been present at a séance that shook him. He said that during the Easter of 1935, he was part of a séance involving Lawrence of Arabia, Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England, George Bernard Shaw, Bernard Spilsbury, who was a Home Office criminal forensic scientist, and Marianne Foister, like a woman at the heart of it all, at the centre of it all. To quote Louis Marling, "We chose an ill-lit and underground cellar at about midnight and sat in silence. Someone gave a nervous cough and was about to speak when an extraordinary thing happened. The kitchen bells seemed to clang together in one single clash." Now, according to Marling, there was nobody else in the house at the time. It was just them in this unlit basement room when the bells started ringing elsewhere in the house. Quote, "Norman jumped up and then there was a lightning strike of silver blue light which appeared to implode from all the walls and the ceiling of the cellar, and then there was a dead silence." Now, Marling said that everyone was frozen to the spot, as though struck by my paralysis that I experienced in the Cocos Islands. He said he was blinded by the light and that he only recovered sight in one eye from that time on. Quote, "I can't explain that occurrence, and to be honest, it still makes me feel rather shaken. The rest of the hauntings were, without exception, the most successful hoax of the age, but that one still sets my spine tingling." I'll leave it there.